Welcome to today's AI in Practice webinar. That's Student Voices Navigating AI in Higher Education. My name is Julia Gofretti. I'm the Emerging Learning Technology Lead here at the University of Baltimore, and I'm stepping in today to introduce the session on behalf of Dr. Jessica Stansberry, who is with us today but has unfortunately lost her voice. Um, this has been a wonderful series that we've conducted with our partners at the University of Baltimore, both CELT and the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, as well as in partnership with our colleagues at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Johns Hopkins University. This is our last webinar of the academic school year. We're so grateful for everybody's support throughout this series, making these conversations possible. And we're so grateful for everyone who has registered and joined us throughout the semester. Um, really excited for today's session because it highlights a perspective that's essential as we consider the future of AI in higher education. We're bringing in the student voice today. So our panelists will share their experiences navigating learning environments where generative AI is becoming more present and offering their reflections on both the opportunities and challenges um, this technology brings. So I'm going to briefly introduce our student panel. We have Yonatan Harris, a dual degree psychology student at the University of Baltimore, who's passionate about accessibility, cognitive processes, and ethical applications of AI. We also have Rosie Anderson, a PhD student in the gerontology program at UMBC, whose research explores how family ties and social determinants shape health outcomes across diverse communities. We have Brian Furr, an MBA student at the University of Baltimore and operations manager at Climb.io, where he helps lead initiatives focused on emotional intelligence and mindfulness for youth. And then we have Rahul Jakati, a senior at Johns Hopkins University studying history, biology, and creative writing, with a research focus that bridges science and storytelling. So, guiding today's conversation is our moderator, Mike Reitz, who is Associate Dean and Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence and Innovation at Johns Hopkins University. Mike oversees a wide range of programs that support teaching and learning, including pedagogical development, educational technology, internal grant initiatives, and collaborative research on innovative teaching processes. So, without further ado, I will turn things over to Mike.
Thanks, Julia. I appreciate that. In addition to my role working with the Center for Teaching Excellence and Innovation, I'm also an associate teaching professor in sociology. And before we get started, because this is our last session of the year, I just want to give a special thanks out to Jessica and Julia. It's been great. This partnership we've had between UMBC, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Baltimore has been incredibly fruitful. And that is because of the leadership that Jessica and Julia, they've done much of the heavy lifting. So I want to give a shout out to them. In addition to John Fritz and John Schumacher from UMBC and Henry Mortimer, who isn't on the panelist list right now, who've also been involved in organizing this. But Jessica and Julia have done a lot of the work. So thank you so much for everything you've done. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. And we've got a couple of questions for the student panelists about their experience with AI personally, but also in their classwork. And then we'll leave time at the end to open it up for all of you, the participants, to ask questions as well through the question and answer component of the Zoom interface. So we're going to start with the first question, which is just a broad one about how have you, the student panel, used generative AI to support your learning? And so why don't I start with Rosie, and then we'll move on to Brian.
So thanks everybody. It's nice to talk to you today. I'm actually a huge fan of AI, so I've used it across a lot of different things, both personally and academically. So in terms of academic use, I've used it a lot for my research. So specifically having to write a lot of papers and do a lot of research for like academic sources and things like that. There's a lot of good AI tools that help you visualize those research connections, kind of understand how like different papers relate to each other. I've also like collaborated with like my classmates where I've showed them like, oh, look, this is what I found on this AI app, and then they've like, shared with me like what they found, and we've collaborated that way. So lots of different ways there. And then in addition to that, just kind of more broadly, like in my statistics work, in classes and things like that, I've used, ChatGPT to troubleshoot code, break down difficult concepts and things like that, where I'm like, okay, I think I understand the logic behind this, but let me just ask ChatGPT just to verify. So, yeah.
That's great to hear. I teach a stats class that Rahul was actually in, and that's one of the things I'm thinking about next year when I teach it again is how can we use large language models to help students with the programming? Many of them struggle with that. So we'll go to Brian and then to Jan.
Yeah, so pleasure to meet everybody. I utilize AI in a variety of different ways, professionally, personally, and academically. So professionally, um, let me just mention my role at Climb is an operations manager. So I am all about finding efficiencies, automating tasks wherever necessary, finding redundancies, trying to figure out how to streamline, creating standard operating procedures. And I've utilized AI to kind of streamline that process, like um, understanding, well, we're moving forward in time and technology. It's going to be a part of our business practices. How do we use this ethically? How do we create standard operating procedures around this? What are the expectations on this? And kind of being clear about that from the beginning. I run a team with a variety of different people in locally and internationally. And it's important to kind of set those standards. And then when you're sending 30 emails, if it's marketing emails or anything, proofreading and those types of things, that's really straightforward. I tend to use AI a little more on the, not to create an initial document, but more proofreading. And then on a personal level, I use AI almost like a personal coach or assistant. I feed it informations of, okay, well, based on the 7 habits of highly effective people, how should I approach this? Sometimes I speak into the AI platform for 30 minutes and say, well, what are my blind spots in this moment? And really allow it to be an objective view or perspective that I can take on and in my own way gain a competitive advantage or leverage that in whichever way, because I'm human. We have sometimes we have ways we want to do things, and then there's like just pedagogy. There's ideas that are already created, and there's no point in reinventing the wheel. And then finally, academically, very similar to what Rosie had said. I just took a Python class, checking code, going back over and seeing like, okay, well, which, when it comes to code, there's a variety of ways things could be written to get to the same endpoint, and just kind of finding the most streamlined way to go and do it, but also in a many ways just proofreading and figuring out like, well, what's going on here. So those are some examples of the way that I use AI professionally and personally.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate the expansive examples you gave too. It's not just for coursework, but even your own personal development and professional development as well. I mean, I think that's what's important about those of us who are educators and trying to incorporate it into our class is not only to help students learn within our classes, but also to show them how these tools might be able to help them in other ways too, co-curricular, extracurricular, and potentially even just personally as well. So, Jan, why don't we jump to you before we hear from Rahul?
Thank you. Again, I think this is a great question. For me, generative AI has kind of become part of my toolkit as a graduate student and a working professional in higher education. But honestly, before I even open up one of these AI tools, I make it a point to stop and ask myself first, kind of why am I using this? Why am I reaching for this tool? And how specifically am I going to use this to support my learning and not just to shortcut it? And I think that moment of reflection is really key for me. With that in mind, one of the main ways I use it is sometimes at the start of a project to kind of get up and running. If I'm stuck on a concept or I need to explore kind of different angles, how can I use it to brainstorm or even just build basic outlines? I think of it kind of as like a conversation partner, helping me to, again, kickstart my thinking, not to replace it, but help support. I think another area is refining my writing. I think sometimes if a paragraph feels clunky, or isn't flowing how I think it should, I may use AI to help critique that writing. One of the specific prompts that I like to use is critique this paragraph, highlighting the strengths and the weaknesses. So instead of having it rewrite it for me, it gives me those critiques, and I can take those critiques back and make the adjustments that I need to, using my own critical thinking skills, my own thoughts. You know, it's like getting a quick kind of first pass review to ensure that my thoughts are coming across effectively. Another way, I might ask for a summary to help me understand complex information. Sometimes it could be maybe a dense academic paper or a concept from another field that I'm not familiar with. But critically, I kind of always return to the original source. I'm the fact checker for AI. I can't rely on it. We understand that it's not always 100%. And my responsibility as the end user is to ensure that I'm going back to the original source to verify, and ensure that I'm ultimately grasping the concepts that I need. So kind of that how part is using it as a bridge, not a destination. That makes sense. So for me, it's really about intentional use, leveraging it as an assistant for brainstorming, clarifying language, getting initial summaries, again, while constantly checking that I'm doing the core intellectual work. And again, that prior reflection on why and how kind of guides my engagement.
Great, thank you. I appreciate all those examples, but more important, describing the importance of the intentionality and reflective piece. Metacognition is an incredibly important part of learning, and not just doing, but thinking about what we're doing and processing that is an important piece. So I'm glad to see you say that. And I think I'm going to have to pull that idea that, you know, we are AI fact checkers is important. So, you know, we have some agency as well in this process. Thank you. So Rahul, let's hear from you. How are you using AI to support your learning?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think as Jan kind of echoed already, you want AI ideally to supplement your learning, not to replace it, right? And the way I would kind of think about how I use it is maybe a metaphor is kind of in tennis, right? One way that people practice is to use like the backboard. So if you go up to a wall, you just hit it back and forth. And the fact is that if you don't know what you're doing, you just hit it back and forth, your form will get worse. If you build bad habits, it'll only get worse. But if you know what you're doing, if you hit it correctly, you can kind of use it as an initial practice tool. You just like hit the ball back and forth. You literally use it as a springboard to kind of advance your knowledge on a specific topic. And I agree with Jan and what others have echoed in the sense that it's good as a first pass, right? So whenever I'm perhaps struggling with a certain paper that's a little bit too esoteric, I can feed it into some kind of LLM and it can summarize it, give me a first pass summary, give me the main arguments. But the specific granularities, that's often a lot more difficult for me to get from a AI. But sorry, my phone is having an alarm. Another way I like to use AI is as a kind of, once again, echoing that metaphor for as a springboard, is as a kind of practice tool. So as you mentioned, I was in that stats class with you. And one way that I'd help prepare for those exams that we would have is I would simply ask like ChatGPT to simply generate a bunch of test questions, right? You could say here are some common topics that I expect to be given on the exam? Can you give me maybe 10 problems that covers every single nuance that's covered in the specific topic? So for example, if this is like a biology class, I would say, give me one question about this aspect of the cell, another question about this specific microtubule of the cell. And from doing that, you can really get this kind of comprehensive array of all the different topics that might be covered and the ways that might be tested. And it's not an end all be all, of course, you kind of want to have some critical thinking beyond that. But I find it to be very useful to kind of return to that metaphor as a kind of springboard in that sense.
Great, thank you. I like that metaphor of the springboard as well. And, conversations I have with you and with others, one of the things I'm hoping to do is develop my Spanish language skills. And I think I'm going to be using it as well as a conversation piece to help me with that practice. So hopefully be more of a springboard than just a backboard to, would you say, to, you don't want to reinforce bad habits. So, well, Rahul, why don't we stick with you for our next question? We'll go back through the group in reverse order. So what are some creative uses of AI your instructors implemented in your courses, if anything at all?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think with the advent of AI, there's going to have to be whole new ways to think about how we incorporate it or, kind of expunge it from the classroom. But in terms of my professors who actually, really embrace the use of AI, I'm taking a class right now on theoretical neuroscience. So it's very computationally based. And a lot of the class is actually about how LLMs work on kind of computational level. And what our professor has decided to do is throughout the class, we have a series of presentations you have to give, right? So these are individual presentations. You can't really fake them, right? Because you can't have an LLM give a presentation for you. But before we kind of go into the presentation itself, we have to submit certain outlines, outlines that help us plan or frame how we're going to eventually present it. And for those outlines, we're actually allowed to essentially, instead of giving outlines in the sense of okay, here's what the first minute's gonna look like, here's what the second minute's gonna look like, we can instead submit our conversations with an AI, where the conversation might go something like, okay, hey, ChatGPT, I'm going to be doing a presentation on so-and-so topic. How would you advise I sort it out? And you can have talk to it. And then what the professor really wants from you in these conversations is for you to show critical thought in terms of not what ChatGPT is saying, but what kind of human questions you're asking it. So he's more concerned with, are you able to kind of critically think your way to a good outline by talking to ChatGPT rather than what exactly ChatGPT is saying, if that makes sense. So for example, if ChatGPT says, hey, you should spend your first couple of minutes talking about the prefrontal cortex, he would maybe want you to say in kind of the conversation that you're having with this ChatGPT, why the prefrontal cortex? Wouldn't the occipital lobe be better? And that kind of critical thinking that you can get from having this kind of conversations, as you mentioned before, as a kind of backboard, he really enjoys reading that, and he kind of used that as a supplement for critical thinking instead of just submitting an outline.
That's great. And if I can ask you just to concisely answer this follow-up question, did he also prep you on how to critically prompt LLMs to go through the process that he had asked you to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the very first day, he actually had we had a little live demo where he pulled up Claude, which is one of the side, one of the offshoots of ChatGPT, and he basically went through a conversation live with it. And then he did the same thing with kind of ChatGPT, the voice version. And he kind of walked us through how he wanted us to ask it questions, what kind of things he wanted us to ask it about, what not to do, how to get it to not hallucinate or regurgitate certain pieces of info. And he was very good about that because he studies LLMs, in his research. So he kind of knew how to walk us through. So that kind of tutorial at the very beginning of class was very helpful in that sense.
Great, a little prompt engineering 101 in your class.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jan, and then Brian, curious what what examples you have to share.
Yeah, so we're talking about how instructors are using AI. In my classes so far, I haven't seen many of my faculty actively using AI creatively with students yet. I want to say the yet part. I did take a course over the summer, a communications course, where the professor was kind of leaning heavily on the students to engage with AI, to not just supplement his understanding, but to get a better idea of how students are utilizing AI. So then he could take that into kind of how he structured his course, which I thought was great. What I will say is I think some of the nervousness that some folks are experiencing, and that I'm sure a lot of universities are facing, is just there's not, or there doesn't appear to be kind of clear rules and guidelines for everyone. Folks are kind of still figuring out what works best for them. And we're kind of all in this learning curve phase, which, you know, sessions like this are incredibly meaningful and necessary. I think we have to think about, I think part of that learning curve probably involves instructors using AI behind the scenes. The students may not directly see that. You know, I know of some professors that have used AI to help develop their syllabi, to maybe look at their syllabus in a different, or their assignments in a more accessible way. And I've seen and worked with some faculty to actually do some of this work, which has been really exciting. Some things that I've seen them do is how they structure their assignments, kind of checking to ensure that their assignments really align well with the course learning objectives. I think some things that could help us consider how to move forward with more visual or interactive integration would be clearer guidelines from a university or an institutional level. Would make a huge difference. Having a shared understanding of ethical use, and while ensuring academic integrity, I think instructors and students could benefit from some dedicated support. And I think also having those parameters allow us to feel a little more comfortable with experimenting on our own as well. And then I think something that I've also seen is, you know, we have workshops and things for faculty. As a professional working in higher education, I had the unique opportunity of kind of seeing both fields. My personal experience as a student and working in higher ed, I have the opportunity to attend some of these workshops and meet with faculty and engage and help figure out and share kind of what works in the classroom. I think we need more of these kind of practical workshops that focus on teaching with these tools. I think also things like this, where we have students who can come in and actively contribute to this process. I think students can offer constructive feedback about where we think AI could be useful in our learning, and maybe get involved in some of these pilot programs or testing new approaches. I think overall, it just boils down to the need for more open conversations and teamwork between, you know, all the stakeholders, students, faculty, administration. And we're all in this together. Not to use a cliche, but we are a team in the learning experience. And I think it's important that we're all a part of the discussion to figure out how to best use these powerful tools to support education, both behind the scenes and in our direct learning experiences.
Yeah, I would agree. And you know, I would even extend, you know, part of that learning process. I'll give a shout out to John Schumacher, who I've been engaging with for a while on this topic. And he was one of the first people to really push me to say, we have to figure out how it's going to change our discipline, learning how to use these tools in our work, whether that's research or other professional activities, so that we can then bring it to the students as well. So Brian, why don't we jump to you, and then we'll go over to Rosie for your thoughts about creative uses of AI, if at all, in any of the classes you've taken.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a kind of a unique perspective. Just as a note, I'm getting my MBA candidate for the artificial intelligence and machine learning track at University of Baltimore. And in my classes, I haven't seen, let me be thoughtful of my words. Not so much in the direct completion of assignments, very similar to what Raul had mentioned. I've had a professor mention, this is a way for you to create your own study guide. This is a way for you to kind of work through understanding the curriculum resources, and then getting questions that are similar to what might be on the midterm or final, right? And then that's one type of experience that I've had, which I don't think is relatively creative, but it is one type of experience. On another hand, at Climb, we are working on a MIPS grant with Morgan State University, which I'm also an alum of Morgan State University, and their department over there is helping us create a language model. And I think that's been more creative in a sense, but it's not like I'm working from a different capacity with the university in that way, because I'm working with Climb. But in that way, just because the way Climb is set up, kids, school age kids log into our platform and they might mention, I'm not feeling so great. And then they're offered resources in real time. But what if they're not saying, I'm not feeling happy? And what if they're saying, I'm feeling salty? What if they're saying colloquialism? What if they're saying a slang term? And being able to kind of pick up on those nuances, as well as some junior high school age kids. I'm sure you can imagine with your own imaginations the creative ways that they can put something onto our, what we call our wall of wonder. And we need to be able to kind of siphon through these messages that they're putting and say, oh, these need to be blocked and these can actually go through. So in that way, that's been kind of creative in seeing how using AI, that is more intriguing to me, because I have two kids myself. I have two daughters, and I'm very intrigued on how they're going to incorporate the use of AI, because it's not going away. It's not like we're going back in time, but incorporate it into their studies and not just push it away and say, well, that we don't have the space for this. I think it's going to come up if they like it or not, and being in the forefront and saying, okay, well, how do we use these things? And I think Climb has done a way where we can kind of like slowly integrate certain things in a way where it's more of the back end and not so much on the front end. And then my last example, not to be long-winded, but my last example being, I'm a mentor to at-risk youth, and I tend to encourage them to use AI, not so much in the academic setting, but the mindset setting, and helping them navigate difficult feelings and emotions in order to get to their academics. So allowing it to help them think through the feelings that they're having that might be getting them to procrastinate, allowing them to create a schedule with the AI tool and say, well, what's the most efficient way for you to go about doing this? Allowing them to ask some of those questions that they're not going to knock on another person's door and say, hey, I'm going through this feeling. I don't know how to experience it, because in the setting that I'm talking about, a lot of these youth have a very hard time expressing their feelings or expressing their difficulties. So it comes off of more like a safe space, because it's a non-biased approach. And then by way of them using the AI, then they're able to actually get to their academics. So it's not using it for their academics, but using it to help them stay motivated and propel them to do the things necessary to get to the point where they're sitting there and doing the work that they need to go and do. So getting them in the right mindset, which is almost like a very different way than I think most people think about AI in an academic setting. But I think of it like, how can we use this tool to support them to get through so they can get to the work, you know?
Yeah, yeah, sure. The emotional piece of being motivated and enthusiastic and, is important for learning. I will also add, I mentioned, trying to learn Spanish, these tools could also be useful for me to at least try to understand teenagerisms, because there's a lot of slang. I'm not really sure I understand what's coming out of my own kids' mouths these days. So, Rosie, why don't we jump over to you? Any creative uses that you've seen in your classes?
Sure. Yeah, so I think while not a lot of my professors have utilized AI in the classroom, everyone that has definitely used it in a creative way. So in one class, we uploaded like an assignment rubric to an AI platform, and then we used it to basically break down the rubric and make suggestions on our own work. So like we'd upload the rubric, tell the AI model to, understand all the requirements and then give us feedback on our own assignment. Then we'd upload our assignments or maybe parts of our assignment. And then we would go back and forth in the chat to kind of get like more personalized feedback. So I think that was really helpful because it like helped analyze our work against like common issues, but also like the specific things that we told it to analyze, right? So there's that. And then in another class, we also did like workshopping with research questions. So we had a research paper due at the end of the semester. So we would put in our research question at different points throughout the semester. And so we used AI to kind of help us like refine our questions, suggest different methodologies, identify any gaps, and things like that. So it definitely helped like strengthen our research design before we got to that final paper.
Awesome. Sounds similar to what Rebels Group was doing as well. Yeah. So why don't we go, we've got another question and then we'll open it up for questions from our participants that I know are starting to come in. So maybe in like 1 or 2 minutes, if you could just take this next question, which is moving beyond the creative uses, and Jan, you've addressed some of these already, things you'd like to see. So what do you wish faculty were doing differently in the classroom regarding the use of AI, including talking about it or clarifying policies? Jan, I know you also mentioned at the institutional level, hoping to see policies. So for this question, why don't we start with you? Just in 2 minutes or so, what do you see as what would you like to see more happening in the classroom or at your institution?
Sure, thank you. So I think thinking about what I, as a student, wish my faculty would do differently with AI. Again, kind of especially around policy, as you were saying. Number one is definitely clarity on the rules right up front. I think it would be amazing if I think professors would take a few minutes, maybe at the start of the semester, in the first class. I think that would be really important, just to spell out kind of what their expectations are for their course. Obviously, this kind of would pair with the institutional guidance, kind of help us understand what's okay, what's not okay, and even kind of providing a quick kind of rationale behind their approach. Building on that, maybe a quick note on assignments, even if it's something like AI is fine for brainstorming, or no AI drafting for this essay, to help students kind of get a better sense of what the specific boundaries are for each task. I think that reduces some of the student stress and some of the guesswork surrounding acceptable use. Moreover, I think I would love to hear more instructors talk about AI more openly. and how it impacts the student, maybe even how they're utilizing AI. I think, like we've established, these tools are everywhere. They're changing our fields. It's not going anywhere. And I think part of our responsibility, and one of the things that I like to champion with any of the folks that I discuss AI with or AI use with, is the ethical kind of piece. How do we use this ethically and responsibly? Having folks, giving folks a better understanding of some of the limitations of AI, and how it may impact our future careers. As a future IO psychologist, it's helpful to have an understanding of how AI can impact my future career. And then the idea of just a blanket no AI rule. I think it's not realistic in a sense. I think for some things, sure, it makes sense. But helping folks understand the rationale, I think it increases buy-in from the students' perspective of, okay, this is why my professor doesn't want me to use AI for this assignment. Especially if it's a check your understanding kind of thing.
Yeah.
So some of the two quick examples that I just threw in is like a clear section in the syllabus, that day one chat, creating a dedicated AI policy section to clearly state their expectations, and maybe even like an AI rules in each assignment prompt. So ultimately, I think it comes down to wanting clear communication, open discussion about why this matters, and understanding the reasons, the rationale for the rules. I think it makes navigating AI use.
Yeah, and I would jump in to say that, you mentioned your own intentional use with learning, that for faculty, they have to be intentional about if they're going to clearly communicate what is okay for students to do or not. They have to be intentional in thinking about what those rules are. Why don't we go to Rahul and then Brian to hear on this as well? What would you like to hear or see from faculty?
Yeah, so I think for me it's just clarity. I think is the primary thing, because I feel as if right now we're kind of maybe in a murky area where it's not strictly Boolean in some syllabi as to whether or not AI is allowed, or maybe it might be, they might not strictly disallow it, but if you use it, you might get like penalized for it. I'm being kind of like vague in what I mean here, but what I essentially kind of like, what I prefer in kind of like classes is either a very strict, no, you cannot use AI, but along with that, I also want them to, if they're going to be like very strict about non-AI usage, I want it to be like very difficult for students to like use AI at all. And what I mean by that is like I had one class where there were so many students using AI that what the professor ended up doing is that they made the test percentages so high and in person that you couldn't use AI to pass the class. Like you could use AI on all the homework, but if you didn't pass the final exam, you wouldn't pass the class. And that's something that I thought was useful on the one end, but on the totally opposite end, I'm also a fan of classes that totally embrace AI. And it's kind of like the assignments, even if you use as much AI as you want, it's simply not possible to complete the assignment to a satisfactory degree because the AI just isn't there yet. And of course, that might change with how technology develops. But I'm thinking of one class where the aim of the project was to essentially take a bunch of different papers from a wide variety of fields in topics that AI aren't like very well meshed in at the granular level, and having to synthesize a broad essay, a research essay based off of that. And those two opposite ends, those two poles of what I consider, that's kind of where I want a class to be. But that kind of murky middle ground where It's not very clear like whether or not AI is allowed, and maybe some students are using it to have a certain advantage that other students don't have. That I think I maybe prefer less of.
Yeah, and I think it's murky for faculty as well. I know many of us are trying to
Totally,
figure out
yeah.
what is the balance there. Brian, how about you? And then we'll go to Rosie and then open it up for audience questions.
Yeah. So I want to be thoughtful about this because I think that we have to consider what field we're talking about. I think I'm coming from a business background, an entrepreneurship background. So in many ways, I like to think disruptively. I mean, it's just kind of that's what you do in entrepreneurship. You figure out how to kind of disrupt a little bit in order to kind of create a market or open up doors, right? So I think that you have to accept the fact that AI is here. I heard that before, and I agree with that sentiment. That it is here, and it, but there are critical skills that could be used adjacent to AI that you can't fake. You have to do some of the work. And then there's other parts like if I leave this class or get this degree, and then the work world just expects that there's a component of AI and everything, it's like, I need to know this, but what other parts that I need to just be functional in? And I hope I'm not being long-winded. I hope I'm being clear, but what I'm trying to say is, at least from a business standpoint, I think understanding that it's going to be a part of business life, culture, and integrating that as early as possible. Also keeping in mind Moore's law is blown out the water as far as I'm concerned. Every 6 months, things were supposed to get so advanced that like the last 6 months advancement is almost obsolete. And I think it's almost weeks at this time. So at the beginning of a semester, a professor can reasonably say, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want this. And then AI can actually be integrated in the platforms. Like I took a Python class and you use Jupyter Notebook. Jupyter Notebook has their own AI that's checking your code. If I want to use it or not, it's being used, and it's like, you kind of have to just accept that this is the world that we're in. I mean, I can imagine a year from now, things that have nothing to do with AI. We're going to have like AI powered toasters, or AI powered toothbrushes. It's like Bluetooth, it's everywhere, So I think this acceptance that is here and being more creative and thoughtful, like, okay, I want to ask, how are you using it? I wanted to see your thought process. I really like that as an idea because to be very stringent and really not know what the work environment is going to be like a couple of years from now or a month from now, 2 months from now, it can drastically change. It could be incorporated in everything. And just being open to kind of like being exploratory, because this is an exploratory time where you have to kind of embrace and adapt and mold. And some information, just full transparency, is not going to be as relevant to remember. I remember, if I can use an analogy, and I hope I'm not being long-winded once again, but when I was younger, I used to have to remember cell phone numbers, and the idea of like saying that to my daughter is like, like why would you have to do that? And there's going to be a lot of parts in our life that we think are so necessary to know, and it's like it's just going to be common practice to bypass some of that stuff. So really getting to the root of how do we solve problems, how do we help the world, how do we create opportunities is more important for me than the vehicle used to do it. I think looking at a problem, using design thinking or being creative about a solution it could be integrated with AI much easier in a lot of ways. I think the incorporation of that, at least from a business standpoint, to solve problems, to help people, I think that it's better to go about it that way. But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, sure.
I can imagine that there's a variety of different disciplines that that just isn't as applicable. If you're a doctor, you got to know your stuff.
I don't know.
You can't go to GPT, but
I think it's
there's a
going to
little bit
become
of
more
space.
ubiquitous in terms of people's ability to do that. And that's one of the things that we as instructors are going to have to figure out. Rosie, what are your thoughts about faculty incorporating what you'd like to see in either your classes or from an institution level?
Yeah, I think just to kind of echo everybody else's responses about kind of having that open line of communication between faculty and students, clear documentation about how it can be used, when to use it, when is it acceptable, when is it academic dishonesty. And I've seen a few people or, online and stuff talking about, citing or documenting AI use. So if a professor does say it's okay, then maybe acknowledge that, for this assignment or this part of the assignment, I've used AI to generate, sample problems or something like that. In terms of institutional level, I think that particularly for undergrads, but obviously grad students and others that have a lot of writing to do and research, I think that maybe the library or the writing center at various institutions could kind of offer some sort of AI writing assistance, because people may use AI, but they may not be using it in the best way possible. They may be using it to kind of, get the assignment completed, but it's not really using that brain power behind that only a person could really offer. So I think that would be good. And then again, with like the statistics and things like that, that would be really helpful too for like students that are just learning to code or just learning with how to do things in terms of troubleshooting or interpreting results and things like that. I think that would be really helpful too.
Great, great. Well, even more reason for me to incorporate that into programming in Stata next year in my stats class. Well, I want to thank you all. I know we have some questions from our participants. So Julia, do you want to elevate some questions from our attendees?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with, we have a similar question from two people, and that is going into the access to tools. So do you have adequate access to AI tools to support your academic work? And are you looking for the universities to provide access to premium models, whether that's OpenAI or Anthropic or some of these other resources? Um, so just really quickly, as we go through some of these questions, just brief thoughts, feel free to chime on in these Q&A questions.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Rahul.
Rahul. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think once again, as someone mentioned earlier, it depends on your field. I don't necessarily think that I'm a creative writing major, and at least one of my majors is creative writing, and I don't necessarily think we need access to ChatGPT Premium, to write a short story. On the other hand, I take computer science classes, and we actually I find ChatGPT very helpful for that. And in that sense, Hopkins provides like GitHub Copilot, which has been great. So I think it's about field. I would say is my quick answer.
And Jan,
Yeah.
go ahead next.
So I think the big challenge here is to think about this from an accessibility lens. We also have to understand that the folks that are not going to have access to these premium models are going to be the folks that don't financially have the means to make it happen. So I don't necessarily have a solution per se, but I think we have to be very conscious and intentional about providing these tools and resources to the with the idea of leveling the playing field. I work full time, and I'm able to pay for a Grammarly subscription, where one of my fellow students struggles to, nobody should have to make the decision of, do I put food on my table or, use a resource that a lot of other folks may have access to already. I think we just have to be very mindful of, but I say this with the understanding that these things cost money. So there is a financial burden on the institution if we're going to make these tools available to all of our students. Thinking of equity, then it's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge, but we certainly have to be mindful to ensure that these things are accessible to the folks that need them, and that these resources are equitably distributed across our institutions.
Thank you for that. I am going to shift to another question. So, Brian and Rosie, if you want to hop in on this one, I'm going to kind of fuse another couple together. Just looking at how you think the college experience is going to change with respect to the implementation of AI. So, what are we expecting to see from the student side of their capabilities, but also what do you expect to see from the faculty side? Do you expect to see more AI assessing? Do you expect to see more AI grading or things of that sort? So, kind of your thoughts on how this will affect the college experience.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of tie in both of those answers and try to keep it brief. I think that standardization of like a basic, or at least within a department, let's say everybody in finance uses a specific type of one. Maybe everybody in a biology setting uses a specific type of one, but they're creating that standard. I think can have benefits because then it's less likely. Well, anybody can kind of use an alternative, right? But they can then say, well, if everybody's using this, then these are the proofs to be able to say this is how I want this to be used. It's creating a culture around using it and creating a standard. And I hear what Jan was mentioning also, but that kind of mimics life in a lot of ways. Like I think that it's going to be a little disproportionate for some people in certain ways, and I think the standardization can be helpful. And then finally, on campuses and an academics setting, I think it's a tool like anything else. There's going to be people who are going to be bad actors, and there's going to be people who are going to use it with integrity. And just because somebody has a tool, I don't think that there's an actual great uh what's the word, where it doesn't equal the playing field, because what I know is that like the ability to think critically and create a certain type of prompt directly changes the outcome drastically. And then even the work that you do in the AI to like proofread or do the extra work, are you just creating your own thoughts and then having it proofread it and then cleaning up on Grammarly versus just having it written and then just having an end result and putting it in? And I think that although a lot of people are putting in more work at a higher frequency, it's not all equal. And when you read some emails from people, when you look at papers, and like you can tell certain things like, that's not a human tone. That doesn't have personal experience. He doesn't know what he's talking about. They kind of just put in a prompt, got something back, and just submitted it. You can kind of read through the lines. So there is some skill that has to be used, and it's not just a great equal playing field where you put in a prompt and you just get the result. I don't think so. And I think that's going to also translate into the work world after, which I think is going to be more important as time goes.
Yeah, and in terms of, I guess how I can see, faculty or administration using AI in the future, I think it could definitely be used for kind of streamlining things in terms of, like course registration or maybe advising. Students could probably interact with some sort of AI to answer their questions that maybe they need regarding like financial aid or things like that are kind of commonplace that they might not need to necessarily go to someone in person to speak to about these things. But and in terms of students, I think we can probably expect one of two things or maybe both at the same time. One would be kind of a better quality of work that they provide based on how they're using these AI tools. And on the other hand, a lack of critical thinking and creativity, which is kind of like the dark side of students using AI. But I think it really depends which tools people are using and how they're using them in the end.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. I do want to be mindful of time and I want to give an opportunity for our partners here from Johns Hopkins and University of Baltimore Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, as well as University of Maryland, Baltimore County. As we wrap up, students, we really thank you for your time and your perspective. Any other final thoughts from our partners from UMBC or JHU as we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I personally want to thank you, Rosie, Jan, Rahul, and Brian. We really appreciate your diverse perspectives and sharing your experiences with these tools. And I just, one more time, want to elevate from the beginning, Julia and Jessica. Thank you for your leadership on this series over the past year.
I asked one quick question that how did the students learn kind of best practices? Like you all have great best practices, and we're wondering, as institutions, like how do we scale those best practices? Like what techniques did you use to learn how to do this well? Because you're doing it well.
And maybe concisely, we have about 3 minutes left. Just a quick round robin. Like one tool or approach, Rahul?
Yeah, if I can just say one thing that I really like. So there's the idea in concept called like learning to learn. And often the best way I found to help learn from ChatGPT is to ask it to help you to help it, if that makes sense. So like you can just ask it, how can I best prompt you to tell me the information that I want? And I found that's been remarkably useful. And often it's been programmed in such a way that it wants you to do that. So that's just a quick thing that I found really helpful.
I'll jump in. That's a tool I use as well, is I tell it when I start prompting it, suggest a better question based on the question I ask you, and then I choose to use it or not. So, Jan, you're unmuted. Do you want to share quickly something you've done for learning?
Yeah, I will say it's a massive amount of experimentation. It's connecting with experts. I more recently joined LinkedIn, and there's a ton of resources on LinkedIn. Shout out to Dr. Stansberry. I love her posts, but yeah.
Excellent. And Rosie or Brian, do you want to get the last word in here?
Yeah, I truly believe that utilizing AI in not just the actual work, but the mindset and the preparation and like the motivation and the other things that kind of go into just getting ready for the work. I think that that's one way. I haven't seen a lot of people use it, and I've used it personally. And then when I do see people use it like that, I think that they approach whatever they're doing with more intentionality. So I think that that's extremely important.
Rosie, we got about 30 seconds. I feel like a radio host.
Yeah, so I think for me, definitely learning from faculty members that are more knowledgeable in AI, and also just kind of talking to peers, classmates, and asking them how they've used it or if they've used it, and sort of through that collaboration, we kind of work things out. So, yeah.
Thank you. Julia, do you want to close this out?
All righty. Well, thank you all again. Thank you to our panelists. You provided us with such great insights and perspectives. Thank you again to our university partners. It's been a great collaboration with UBalt, Johns Hopkins, and UMBC. We've had a wonderful time. Thank you, attendees, for joining us virtually. Please take a moment to fill out our survey. This helps us make sure that we are able to continue to bring great content like this to our captivated audience. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful afternoon.